Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is Dr. Ayman Salahuddin Amir, Associate Professor of Human Anatomy and Embryology. In this lecture, we are going to learn about three important pathways: the visual pathway, olfactory pathway, and the gustatory pathway. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to know the different components of the visual pathway, and also you will recognize the different components of the olfactory and gustatory pathways. In addition, you will be able to explain the effects of injuries that occurs in these pathways and their clinical manifestations at different levels of the pathways on anatomical basis. The reference book used in this lecture is the First Aid for Basic Sciences. The visual pathway starts from the retina of the eye. This slide shows you a section. If you look at this cartoon, it shows you a section, transverse section of the skull. This is the skull, and here is the temporal bone, and you can see this is the brain, and it is cut at horizontal or transverse section. This shows you the fields of vision. The right eye has right eye field of vision, and the left eye has left eye field of vision. The field of vision is divided into two parts. Part that's related laterally, so it's close to the temporal bone, so we call it the temporal half of field of vision. And the one that's close to the nose, we call it the nasal half. So the right visual field is divided into temporal part and nasal part. Also, the left visual field is divided into nasal part and temporal part. When you look at the eye, this is the eye. The eye has the cornea lens, and then you have the retina. The retina is the sensitive part for the vision. So the receptors of vision are present in the retina. We will have a magnified view of this part here. Here you can see the retina, and this is the optic nerve that arises from the retina. The retina has several layers, as you will learn in the histology lecture. What I'm interested in is the neurons that are forming the visual pathway. We have only 3 neurons in the retina forming the visual pathway. The first order neuron is a modified neuronal cell, which is a photoreceptor. These cells are the rods and cones. The rods and cones make the first order neuron. The rods mediate the black and white vision, and the cones mediate the color vision. They are the first order neuron. The rods and cones synapse with the second order neuron, which is the bipolar cells. And the bipolar cells synapse with the third order neuron, which is the ganglion cells. From the ganglion cells, the axons of the ganglion cells collect and make the optic nerve. So the optic nerve is made from the axons of the ganglion cells. The ganglion cells of the retina, which is the third order neuron, they receive the input from the bipolar cells and send the information through the optic nerve. Please look again at this picture. You'll see that the retina has 2 colors here. The colors reflect the part of the visual field that is seen by the retina. You know that the light waves run in straight lines. They don't bend. So what is seen from the nasal part of the visual field is sensitized or recepted by the temporal part of the retina. So the nasal field of the vision is perceived or seen by the temporal part of the retina, and the temporal part of the visual field is perceived by the nasal part of the retina. If you look at the retina, you will see that the fibers run in the retina, making the optic nerve, and then reach to the optic chiasm. At the optic chiasm, the fibers split. There are two directions. Some fibers continue in the same side, and some fibers cross to the opposite side. So this point of crossing is very important. As you will see, the fibers that are coming from the temporal retina, they stay in the same ipsilateral side. But the fibers that come from the nasal hemiretina, they cross to the opposite side. If you follow the colors, you will be able to know that the blue color here coming from the nasal hemiretina is crossing to the opposite side to meet with this blue color from the temporal hemiretina, and then together they make the optic tract. So the optic tract is carrying what is seen at the opposite side. The left optic tract is carrying what's seen at the right half of the visual field of the right eye and the right half of the visual field of the left eye. And similarly, the lateral geniculate body and the optic radiation, they are all carrying what is seen at the opposite side. So the left visual cortex is seeing what is present on the right half of the visual fields of both eyes. And the same occurs at the opposite side. So if you look at the right eye, you'll see in the right eye we have temporal half that stays in the same side. The temporal fibers coming from the retina, they stay in the same side. They don't cross at the optic chiasm, and they stay at the right optic tract. The nasal fibers of the right eye, they cross to the opposite side and continue with the left optic tract. So the vision from the right visual field of both eyes is projected to the left lateral geniculate body or lateral geniculate nucleus, and the vision from the left half of the visual field of both eyes is projected to the right lateral geniculate body. The fourth order neuron is the lateral geniculate body or lateral geniculate nucleus, and from there the optic radiation or visual radiation run reaching to the visual cortex. This slide just repeat the same information in a different way so that you can understand it very well and don't mix it up or forget it. As you see, here are the two eyes, and in front of you this is a visual field. This is the right visual field, and this is the left visual field. The right visual field has parts that project to the right eye and to the left eye. So it projects to the nasal hemiretina of the right eye and to the temporal hemiretina of the left eye, as you see the blue color. What will happen is that the optic nerve is carrying both fibers, what is seen in blue and what is seen in red. When you reach to the side of the optic chiasm, there will be crossing, as you see. What is seen in the right visual field, which is in blue, crosses to the left side. So the left optic tract is completely blue. It carries everything that is seen by the right visual field of both eyes, and it reached to the left lateral geniculate body, and it reached to the left visual cortex. So during binocular vision, the word binocular vision, that you are using both eyes. The left and right visual fields are projected on portions of both retina. As you see, both retina show part perceived from the right and left visual field. But each of them, whether it is right visual field or left visual field, reach the opposite cerebral hemisphere only. So the right visual field reach to the left cerebral hemisphere, the left visual cortex, primary visual cortex. The left visual field reach to the right primary visual cortex. Here, the same information is displayed in a form of arrow. The arrow has two parts. Part that has the head of the arrow in red, and the other part that has the tail of the arrow in blue. You'll see this bluish part is on the right side of the visual fields of both eyes. So it is projected in both eyes, and the projection is to the nasal half of the retina of the right eye and the temporal half of the retina of the left eye. The fibers of the nasal half will cross to the opposite side, and the fibers from the temporal half of the left eye will stay in the same side, so that the optic tract receive everything that's blue here, which is coming from the right side. The left optic tract receives everything that's coming from the right half of the visual fields of both eyes, and it reaches to the left lateral geniculate body, and it reaches to the left visual cortex. The same applies in the opposite way here in the right eye. The right eye, if you look at the left visual field, it projects to the right eye and to the left eye. The left visual field projects to the temporal half of the right eye and the nasal half of the left eye. The nasal half of the left eye crosses to the opposite side. The temporal fibers coming from the retina on the right side stay in the same side, so that the optic tract has fibers coming from the opposite side. The right optic tract carry the visual input from the left halves of both visual fields, and it reaches to the right lateral geniculate nucleus, and from there it reaches to the right visual cortex. There is something very important for you to know, which is called the pupillary light reflex. This pupillary light reflex is done by shining a light. Shining a light. You use a flashlight or a torch and shine the light to the retina of the eye, one eye only, and then observe the reaction of the pupil of both eyes. When you shine the light on one eye, you will see pupillary constriction or meiosis in both eyes. Why this happens? As you see in this illustration, this is the light signal going to the retina of the eye, and from the retina of the eye, the light signal affect the retinal ganglion cells, excite them, and the impulse reach to the optic nerve, and this is called afferent. Note that this is a reflex, and when you study a reflex, as you have studied in physiology, you are interested of knowing three things: what is the afferent, what is the center, and what is the efferent. So the afferent, which is the nerve that's carrying the sensory information, this is the optic nerve that carries the visual information. And the information here, since it's coming from the temporal half of the retina, it will stay on the same side. Transient optic nerve, chiasm, and tract on the same side. But it's not reaching to the lateral geniculate body. These fibers of the pupillary light reflex they bifurcate and go directly to the pretectal nucleus, which is present in the midbrain in the same side. So it reaches to the ipsilateral pretectal nucleus of the midbrain. From the pretectal nucleus, the fibers go bilaterally, as you see. They reach to the bilateral Edinger-Westphal nucleus. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus is called the accessory oculomotor nucleus. So from the pretectal nucleus, it reaches to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides. And from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, what will go out is parasympathetic input, because the Edinger-Westphal nucleus is one of the parasympathetic nuclei. And the fibers that are going out from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, they run in the oculomotor nerves on both sides, on the right and on the left. So these fibers in the oculomotor nerve are efferent. So the reflex has two limbs. The afferent limb is the optic nerve, the center is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and the efferent limb is the oculomotor nerve. The fibers that's running in the oculomotor nerve relay in parasympathetic ganglion, which is called the ciliary ganglion, in the right and left side, so it's also bilateral. And then the postganglionic fibers reach to the sphincter muscles of the iris, the sphincter pupillae muscle of both eyes. So when you shine the light on one eye, both pupils on both eyes will constrict. And this constriction is also called meiosis. You will see meiosis in both eyes. In this slide, we continue to learn about the visual pathway. So far, we have reached to the level of the lateral geniculate body, which is the fourth order neuron. The fibers from the lateral geniculate body that reach to the visual cortex are called the optic radiation, but they don't have one direction. They have actually two directions. So the fibers divide into two divisions. Upper division running in the parietal lobe and lower division running in the temporal lobe. The lower division is making a loop called the Mayer's loop, according to the name of the scientist who discovered it. We are studying all of these details because you may see a patient coming to you complaining of loss of vision in one eye or a particular part of the visual field. Just to remind you, the retina, as I mentioned, is divided into two parts: temporal hemiretina and nasal hemiretina. The temporal hemiretina sees what's present in the nasal half of the field of vision. The nasal hemiretina sees what is present on the temporal half of the field of vision. So the light runs in straight lines. That's why what's present in the temporal half of the field of vision is seen by the nasal elytra, and what is present in the nasal half of the field of vision is seen by the temporal retina. So now let's see the examples in this illustration. If you cut through the optic nerve in the right side, the right optic nerve, what will happen? You will lose the vision from the right eye. So the right eye will be blind. So it's called right anopia or right anopsia. It's the same, whether you say it right anopia or right anopsia. If you cut in the midline at the optic chiasm, what will happen? You are actually cutting the fibers that cross from both sides. The nasal fibers coming from the retina crossing to the opposite side in both eyes. And these nasal fibers carrying the vision from the temporal fields of both eyes. So what will happen is that the patient will complain that the lateral or the temporal sides of both eyes are affected. So it's called bitemporal hemianopsia. This is the right eye, and here is the left eye, and you have the temporal side of the right eye is lost, and the temporal side of the left eye is lost when you have a lesion at the optic chiasm. When you have a lesion in the right optic tract, what will happen? The right optic tract, as I said, it receives everything that's present on the opposite side. So it receives everything that's present on the left half of the visual fields of both eyes, because the right optic tract will receive the temporal fibers from the retina that stay in the same side, and will receive the nasal fibers from the left eye that crosses and then gather with the left one to be in the right optic tract. So damage to the right optic tract will cause left homonymous hemianopia. Left because the left halves of both eyes are affected. Homonymous means they are on the same direction, the left of the right eye and the left of the left eye. So they are homonymous. They are both left, whether it is from the right eye or from the left eye. The left fields are affected, so that's why we call it hemianopsia. Left homonymous hemianopsia. When you have a damage affecting the Mayer's loop, what will happen is that you will get left upper quadrantic anopsia. Why this is happening? The Mayer's loop is the lower division of the optic radiation, and what is in the lower division is seeing what is present in the upper part of the visual fields. So since this is the right Mayer's loop, it sees everything on the left in the upper quadrant. So we say is that the damage of the left Mayer's loop will cause left upper quadrantic anopsia. When you damage the right Mayer loop, it will cause left upper quadrantic anopsia because of the damage of the right temporal lobe lesion here affecting the Mayer's loop. When you damage the right upper division, the upper division of the optic radiation sees what is present in the lower parts of the visual field. So when you have a damage in the right upper division, you will get left lower quadrantic anopsia. Left lower quadrantic anopsia. Because I said the light runs in a straight line. So what is present in the brain in the top will see what is in the eye in the bottom, and what is in the brain in the bottom, like the temporal lobe, will see what's in the eye in the top. So that's the direction of the light affecting the neuron that runs straight. Last thing, when you have a lesion in the right visual cortex, what will happen? You will get the effect of left hemianopia with macular sparing. Left homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. Why macular sparing? Because, as I said, what is in the right side will see everything that's present on the left half of the visual fields of both eyes. But the center of vision, which is perceived by the macula of the eye, that is spared because it is bilaterally represented. You will learn later on in the physiology that there are fibers running from the visual cortex of one eye to reach to the visual cortex of the left eye. So that's why what is seen here in the center is also seen on the opposite side in the center. And this correlation between the two visual cortices happens through the splenium of the corpus callosum. That you will learn later on. So the area of the macula is spared when you have a lesion affecting the visual cortex of one side. But you can also get a lesion of the center alone, as you learn in the following slide. Let's see what happens. This slide shows you the lesions in the previous picture and the detail of the location, the site of the lesion, and the findings, the clinical manifestation of that lesion, what you see in the patient. So if you look at the optic nerve, which is the first example in the figure I just showed you, when you cut the optic nerve, you will get ipsilateral monocular loss of vision. This eye is blind. And since the eye is blind, that means the eye will not receive any light signal. It will not see anything. So that's why you will get loss of the ipsilateral direct pupillary light reflex. That means when you shine the light on the eye, which is blind, it will not see anything, it will not see the light, so we will not see the reaction of the pupillary light reflex. There will be no meiosis in the same eye, which is the blind eye, and also there will be no meiosis on the opposite side, because there is no impulse running, because this eye is blind. So you'll get loss of the ipsilateral or the direct pupillary light reflex in the ipsilateral eye, and it will not induce pupillary constriction of either eye. That means both eyes will not react. However, this blind eye has pupillary constrictor muscle, which is not affected because it's supplied by the parasympathetic coming from the oculomotor nerve, which is not affected. The blind eye is damaged by a damage in the optic nerve, not in the oculomotor nerve. So that's why the contralateral or indirect pupillary light reflex will be intact. What is the meaning of contralateral or indirect pupillary light reflex? That means when you shine the light on the healthy eye, the eye that is seeing, it will receive the light signal and it will cause pupillary constriction of that healthy eye, and also with the blind eye, which is not seeing anything because the pupillary constrictor muscle in the blind eye is working and the oculomotor nerve is working, so it will stimulate that muscle to contract. So the light in the contralateral eye induces pupillary constriction in both eyes. So that's called the indirect pupillary light reflex. Now let's see what happens if you damage the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm can be damaged by several ways. Whether it is a midline, as I have shown you in the previous example. If you cut it in the midline, you will get bitemporal hemianopy. The fibers that are crossing at the midline, they are damaged, and these fibers that cross at the midline, they are nasal fibers that carries the vision from the temporal halves of both eyes. So you'll get bitemporal hemianopy. The causes for this optic chiasm mid-sagittal lesion could be due to pituitary tumor in the adult or craniopharyngioma tumor in the children. Another thing can happen at the site of the optic chiasm, which is bilateral lateral damage. That means the optic chiasm is damaged from both sides, from the lateral side of the optic chiasm. What is present on the lateral side of the optic chiasm is the internal carotid arteries. So the internal carotid arteries can get calcified or get aneurysm and make pressure on the sides of the optic chiasm. You know that the sides of the optic chiasm has the fibers that are running ipsilaterally, that the fibers that are not crossing. They are making the lateral borders of the optic chiasm. And these fibers are the temporal fibers that carries the vision from the nasal halves of both eye fields. So when you have a bilateral lateral damage of the optic chiasm, what will happen is binasal hemianopia. When you have unilateral lateral damage of the optic chiasm, that means it's calcification of the internal carotid artery in one side only, you will get contralateral nasal hemianopia. That means the side that you are damaging it, from the lateral side, you will affect the fibers, the temporal fibers that are running without process. And these temporal fibers carry the vision from the nasal halves of the visual field. So you will get contralateral nasal hemianopia. When you damage the optic tract, as I said, the optic tract carries fibers that are taking impulse from the opposite side. That means the optic tract, which is made by the temporal hemiretina of one side and the nasal hemiretina of the opposite side, these two gather and make the optic tract, and they carry the visual impulse from what is located on the opposite visual field. So you will get contralateral because it's the opposite, so it's contralateral, homonymous because they are in the same direction, which is in the opposite hemianopia, whether that's in the right or the left. So it is always contralateral. When you affect the optic tract on the right, you will get damage on the left. When you affect the optic tract on the left, you will get the damage of the field on the right. The geniculocarine tract, or the optic radiation, it has two divisions. The lower division, the Mayer loop, when you have a lesion in it, what will happen is the contralateral upper quadrantanopia. As I mentioned, the light runs in straight lines. So what is seen by the lower part is present in the upper part of the field. So what's seen by the lower part of the optic radiation is present in the upper part in the visual field. So it's contralateral upper quadrantopia. So they call it also as a pie in the sky, because the patient can't see what is high up, but he can see what's lower. So it is pie in the sky. If that pie in the sky is present in the Mayer loop of the right and left sides, so it is bilateral, it's called upper altitudinopia. That means it's upper altitude, that means the upper level affected. So upper altitudinopia. This is due to the damage of both Mayer loops. If you damage the upper division, which is running in the parietal lobe, it will cause contralateral lower quadrantopia, as I have seen in the previous slide. If that contralateral lower quadrantopia is affecting both sides, so it is called lower altitudinopia. Lower altitudinopia. If you look at the last part, which is the visual cortex, the visual cortex can be affected in the perimacular area or the macular area. The macular area of the visual cortex is the part that receives the central vision. If it is affected, the perimacular area, that will lead to contralateral homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing, because I said the macula is bilaterally represented, and it is not common to affect the macular vision. It's not common. So the perimacular area, when it is affected, you will see contralateral, because what is in the visual cortex on one side will see everything on the opposite side. So it's called contralateral homonymous, because they are both halves of the field of both eyes are affected on the opposite. So you see contralateral. If you are damaging the right visual cortex, you will get left homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. However, sometimes the branch coming from the posterior cerebral artery that supplies the tip or the occipital pole, which is having the central vision or macular vision, this small branch may be affected by a small embolus, and then this uncommon condition will lead to central scotoma. That means the person is having vision completely normal, but what is at the middle, at the center of the field is not seen. So scotoma means a part that is not seen, or a small part that is blind. So it is called central scotoma. This slide is a review of what I have mentioned in regards to the visual field defects. So we are going to review everything that has been mentioned, and here you can see another cartoon showing all the lesions that are there. So cutting the right optic nerve will lead to blindness of the right eye. This can be due to trauma or to inflammation of the eye, so optic neuritis, so that will cause to right anopia. Right anopia. The right eye is blind. Here it is. When you cut the optic chiasm at the midline, this complete midline transection causes the cutting of the nasal fibers that cross from both sides, and as I said, the nasal fibers see what is on the temporal side of the field. So you'll get this picture, bitemporal hemianopsia, and this can be due to the pituitary tumor or craniopharyngioma. When you have a lesion at the side of the optic chiasm, just on one side, if you have it at the right side of the optic chiasm, this right angle of chiasm lesion will cause damage of the temporal retinal fibers that are not crossing, and these temporal retinal fibers carries vision from the nasal half of the visual field. So what will happen is that right nasal hemianopsia. Right nasal hemianopsia. This can be due to a pressure by aneurysm of the internal carotid artery. If you cut the right optic tract, the right optic tract carries the vision from the left halves of both visual fields. So it will cause left homonymous hemianopsia, and this could be due to a brain tumor or abscess affecting the optic tract. When you cut through the optic radiation, just from the first point of the optic radiation, that means you are cutting the whole fibers, whether it's going to the upper or the lower. So the upper or the lower, you are cutting it from the origin when just emerged from the lateral geniculate nucleus. Complete capsular destruction of this optic radiation. And why we call it capsular? Because you know that the optic radiation runs in two parts. Part in the retrolenticular part and part in the sublenticular part of the internal capsule. That's why you call it capsular. So when you cut it in the right side, you will get left homonymous hemianopia. Left homonymous hemianopia. And this lesion could be due to the affection of the anterior choroidal artery. When you have a thrombus at the anterior choroidal artery, this part will be affected because this area is supplied by the anterior choroidal artery. Or a tumor in this area can be giving the same findings. Then let's see the other halves. We have two halves. One is the Mayer loop. Here is the Mayer loop, and this is the a lesion in the right Mayer loop, or the lower part of the geniculocalcarine tract, will lead to left homonymous superior or upper quadrantic anopsia. Left homonymous superior upper quadrantic anopsia. This is due to the damage of the temporal lobe. If there is a damage in the upper part of the right geniculocalcarine tract, this is the upper part of the right geniculocalcarine tract, that will lead to left homonymous inferior quadrant anopia. Left homonymous inferior quadrant anopia due to the damage in the parietal lobe. Lastly, when you have a damage in the visual cortex itself, so the right striate area or the right visual cortex, if you have a damage, it will cause by the affection of the opposite side, which is left homonymous hemianopsia with macular sparing. With macular sparing, as you see, there is a macular sparing. This area is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, and if the branch that's reaching to the tip where it gets the macular vision, if that branch is affected, it will cause central scotomy. This concludes everything about the visual field defects that you need to know. Please don't hesitate to ask me any questions, and thank you very much. Pathway. The olfactory pathway depends on the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is a purely sensory cranial nerve number 1. This picture is illustration of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And when you look at the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, you'll see at the roof of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, the olfactory nerves are present. The olfactory nerve is made of about approximately 20 olfactory receptor neurons. And when I say olfactory receptor neuron, I mean that the olfactory nerve is in the same time a receptor. So here is a magnified view. It shows the olfactory receptor neurons. It's a nerve cell, it's a neuron, and in the same time it is a receptor. It's a neurosensory cell. It senses through the olfactory cilia, it senses the smells, and the different odorants stimulate the olfactory receptor neurons. So these neurons make the sensory part, the receptive neuron. And from there, this is the first order neuron. It reached to the second order neuron, which is the mitral and tufted cells, which are present in the olfactory bulb. And the axons of the mitral and tufted cells run in the olfactory tract, and then from there it divides into medial olfactory stria or lateral olfactory stria. From the lateral olfactory stria, it reached to the olfactory cortex. Please note that the olfactory, the sense of olfaction and the olfactory system does not depend on the thalamus. So it's not using the thalamus as a relay before reaching the cerebral cortex. It's the only sensation that is directly conducted from the sensory pathway to reach directly to the cerebral cortex without passing through the thalamus. The olfactory pathway depends on the olfactory receptor neurons, as I mentioned. These olfactory receptor neurons are the first order neurons. And from there, the axons reach to synapse with the mitral and tufted cells of the olfactory bulb, which is the second order neuron, and then it reach to the olfactory tract. The olfactory tract contains axons of the mitral and tufted cells, and also there are scattered neurons called the anterior olfactory nucleus. And there are also afferent fibers coming from the olfactory bulb on the opposite side, so from the contralateral olfactory bulb. So what is present inside the olfactory tract? We have first axons of the mitral and tufted cells. Then we have also the neurons making anterior olfactory nucleus. And lastly, we have fibers that are coming from the opposite olfactory bulb. So we have three things: axons of mitral and tufted cells. we have the anterior olfactory nucleus, which is a collection of neurons, or making that anterior olfactory nucleus that you'll see in the following illustration. And then lastly, the afferent fibers coming from the opposite olfactory bulb. The olfactory tract runs posteriorly in the olfactory sulcus or olfactory groove in the inferior aspect of the frontal lobe. When it reaches to the anterior perforated substance, it divides into the medial and lateral olfactory stria, as you have seen in the previous slide. The medial olfactory stria consists fibers from the anterior olfactory nucleus, and they project to the contralateral olfactory bulb via the anterior commissure that you'll see in the following slide. Most of the mitral cells axons enter the lateral olfactory stria and terminate in the primary olfactory cortex and the olfactory tubercle. The olfactory tubercle is a group of neurons present in the anterior perforated substance. So what's the primary olfactory cortex? The primary olfactory cortex is made of the piriform and periamygdaloid cortices, in addition to the uncus. Note that all the cortical targets that are coming from the olfactory bulb are referred to as primary olfactory cortex. The primary olfactory cortex axons reach to the secondary olfactory cortex, which is called the entorhinal cortex, and then from the secondary olfactory cortex it reaches to the tertiary olfactory cortex for olfactory discrimination. This slide shows you the details of the structure of the olfactory bulb and tract. Here is the olfactory bulb and here is the olfactory tract. The olfactory tract contains the anterior olfactory nucleus, and as you see, the anterior olfactory nucleus sends the axons that cross to the opposite olfactory tract and bulb. This crossing occurs at the site of the anterior commissure. So the fibers run in the medial olfactory stria and reach to the anterior commissure, and then to the opposite medial olfactory stria, and then to the opposite olfactory bulb and tract. There are other fibers that are running laterally through the lateral olfactory stria. The lateral olfactory stria reach to the primary olfactory cortex. The primary olfactory cortex is this big area. It is made of the piriform and periamygdaloid cortex in addition to the uncus. The uncus is the most medial part of this cortex. It's called uncus. So it is a big area making the primary olfactory cortex. From the primary olfactory cortex, the axons of the neurons reach to the secondary olfactory cortex, which is called the entorhinal cortex or area 28. And from the secondary olfactory cortex, the neurons send axons to reach to the tertiary olfactory cortex. The tertiary olfactory cortex is actually the posterolateral quadrant of the orbitofrontal cortex, and this is responsible for the olfactory discrimination. So it's called the tertiary olfactory cortex or olfactory association cortex. Its job is to discriminate between the different odors. So it is for olfactory discrimination. In this slide, we are going to learn about conditions that have problems in the olfactory system, like defects, injury, or a lesion. What causes the damage in these cases? The first case is condition of anosmia. Anosmia is the loss of the smell sense. يعني المريض ما بيشمش حاسة الشم فقدها خالص. These patients may also complain of loss of the flavor of foods. يعني حاسة التذوق. يعني حاسة الشم إذا فقدت ممكن أنها تأثر على حاسة التذوق. The causes of ipsilateral anosmia يعني معناها في ناحية واحدة بس في ناحية واحدة فتحة أنف واحدة هي اللي ما بيشمش منها كويس الناحية التانية سليمة ipsilateral anosmia. The causes are head injury as a skull fracture affecting the olfactory nerves or nasal infections that affect the olfactory receptors or a tumoral growth in the anterior cranial fossa like a meningioma damaging the olfactory nerve rootlets. The second condition is called Kallmann syndrome. Kallmann syndrome, it's resulting from the lack of proper formation of the olfactory tract during development. So this is due to a problem happened during the development of the olfactory tract. The hypothalamic neurons usually rely on the olfactory tract to migrate to their destination. So in development, during the formation of the brain, the olfactory neurons depend on the hypothalamic neurons depend on the presence of the olfactory tract so that they use it to migrate to their destination. If there is a defect or a lack of proper formation of the olfactory tract, the neurons will not migrate. So, for example, the gonadotropin releasing hormone neurons will not migrate properly from the olfactory placode to the hypothalamus. This will cause three things: anosmia, hypogonadism, and infertility. Anosmia because of the damage of the olfactory tract. Hypogonadism because these neurons that are not migrating to their destination secrete gonadotropin releasing hormone. And since it's not reaching its target, so there will be decrease in the development of the gonads. So it's called hypogonadism. And also infertility. So that person who has this problem will not be able to have children. So because of the infertility. Oh. The other case is called Foster-Kennedy syndrome. Foster-Kennedy syndrome is caused by anterior cranial fossa tumor or olfactory groove meningioma. If there is a meningioma at this site, at the site of the olfactory groove, it will compress the olfactory tract, the olfactory nerve, and also the optic nerve because they are close to each other. So this meningioma will produce several findings. It will have manifestation as ipsilateral anosmia, ipsilateral optic atrophy, and contralateral papilledema. The anosmia is due to the damage of the olfactory nerve. The optic atrophy is due to the damage of the optic nerve because of the growth of the meningioma compressing on the optic nerve. What is the meaning of papilledema? Papilledema, it is related to the optic cup or the optic disc, the site of attachment of the optic nerve to the eyeball. This area is surrounded by meninges and it has cerebrospinal fluid and it has blood supply, rich blood supply. So the optic cup is called the papilla because it is enlarged a little bit, making a prominence. When there is a swelling in it, so it's called papilledema. It's a sign of increased intracranial tension. So when we say contralateral papilledema, because the tumor, the meningioma, will compress the surrounding structures within the tight space of the skull. You know that the brain and the CSF, all of that is present around the brain in a very limited space, which is the skull. And when there is a growth, the tumor, it will compress all the surrounding structures, the brain structures, and that will raise the pressure. So it causes increase intracranial tension. The rise in the pressure will affect the vessels that are surrounding the optic cup, and that will cause pressure on the vessels, decreasing the venous return, and that optic cup will be congested with pressure that will cause edema. The fluid will increase inside the site of the optic cup, so it will be more prominent, and it happens on the contralateral side because the site of the tumor, the meningioma, it's already having optic atrophy. That means the optic nerve is damaged, the vessels are damaged and almost obstructed. So there is no sign of increased intracranial tension in the blind eyes that have optic atrophy. But the increased intracranial tension is seen in the opposite eye, which is healthy, because the brain, the CSF is surrounding the whole brain. The CSF is surrounding the whole brain from all sides. So if there is a pressure in one area, it will reach to other sides because all of the cerebral hemisphere located within the skull, which is a tight space. Lastly, we'll learn about the temporal lobe epilepsy. Epilepsy بالعربي يعني صرع. The temporal lobe epilepsy, it's epilepsy originated from the temporal lobe, and we have learned in this lecture that the temporal lobe contains the olfactory cortices, the primary and the secondary olfactory cortex. They are in the temporal lobe. If there is a lesion affecting the primary olfactory cortex, like affecting the uncus, which is a primary olfactory cortex, that lesion will causes convulsions or seizures. Seizure means convulsion, يعني تشنجات. It's called uncinate fits because it's arising from the uncus, so it's called uncinate fits, means contractions, involuntary contractions affecting the whole body muscles. These seizures or fits or convulsions are frequently preceded by olfactory hallucinations because this site, the uncus, is primary olfactory cortex, and the overstimulation of it due to the increased electrical discharge of the neurons will cause hallucinations. So the patient will complain as he is feeling there is a bad smell, disagreeable smell. This bad smell come all of a sudden without any reason, and it is just before the incidence of the fits. So it's called aura. aura يعني العلامة، يعني هو المريض يحس أو يشم الريحة الوحشة دي، هو الوحيد اللي شمامها، يعني المكان ما فيهوش أي رائحة سيئة، لكن هو بيشم الريحة الوحشة دي قبل ما تحصل له التشنجات، فيعرف إن أول ما هيشم الريحة يحس إن في ريحة وحشة في مكان، يعرف إن هو هتجيله نوبة الصرع ويدخل في التشنجات. So that's all for the olfactory system defects. Now let's learn about the taste or gustatory pathway. The gustatory system mediates the taste, and it's carried by special sensory division of three major cranial nerves. The three major cranial nerves are the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerves. They carry the taste from the tongue. The facial carries the taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. The glossopharyngeal carries the taste from the posterior one-third of the tongue, and the vagus carries the taste from the root of the tongue and epiglottis. Note that the facial carries the taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue in addition to the taste from the soft palate. So there are two branches from the facial nerve carrying taste sensation. from the greater petrosal nerve carries taste from the soft palate, and from the chorda tympani carries taste from the anterior two-thirds of the taste carried by the three cranial nerves reach to the nucleus and tract, the solitary nucleus and tract, nucleus tractus solitarius or the solitary nucleus and tract. From the solitary nucleus, afferent fibers ascend to reach to the ventral posteromedial nucleus of thalamus, VPM, ventral posteromedial nucleus of thalamus, and also the fibers reach to the hypothalamus and the limbic system. From the ventral posteromedial nucleus of thalamus, the axons are reaching the gustatory cortex, which is the lower part of the postcentral gyrus, the parietal operculum, and the insular cortex. So again, we have three order neurons in the gustatory pathway. The first order neuron is for the cranial nerve ganglia. We have ganglion for the facial and for the glossopharyngeal and for the vagus. These ganglia, they are pseudo-unipolar neurons. That means they have cell body, axon, and the axon is divided in two branches. Branch is the peripheral and branch is the central. So the peripherals receives the taste impulse and then send it to the central to reach to the solitary nucleus. So this is the first order neuron. From the solitary nucleus, the second order neuron rises to reach to the level of the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. The thalamic neurons send the axon, which is the third order neuron, to reach to the gustatory cortex. These fibers run through the internal capsule and corona radiata to reach the taste area or the gustatory area in the lower part of the postcentral gyrus, which is called the parietal operculum, and also in the insular cortex. So again, the gustatory pathway or the taste pathway, it arises from the taste buds from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. The taste buds from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue send the taste signals through the chorda tympani nerve, and those from the soft palate are carried by the greater petrosal nerve. Both of them are branches of the facial nerve. They reach the geniculate ganglion of the facial nerve. This is the first order neuron, the cell bodies of taste fibers. From there, it reaches to the intermediate nerve, which is a branch from the facial, and reach to the solitary tract and nucleus. This is the second order neuron, the second neuron. From the second neuron, which is the solitary nucleus, the axons reach to the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. And that part, the thalamic neurons, they are the third order neuron. From it, their axons reach to the gustatory cortex, which is made by the parietal operculum and insular cortex. In the second part, taste buds from the posterior one-third of the tongue runs. The sensation is sent from there to reach to the lingual branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, and reach to the petrosal or inferior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal. This is the first order neuron. From it, it reaches to the solitary nucleus and tract, and this is the second order neuron. And from it, it reaches to the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. That's the third order neuron. And from the thalamus, the axons of the thalamic neurons reach to the gustatory cortex, which is made by the parietal operculum and insular cortex. From the epiglottis and the root of the tongue, the taste bud receives the taste impulses, and the signals are carried by the superolaryngeal nerve, which is a branch from the vagus nerve, to reach to the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve. This inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve is the first order neuron. From it, it sends the axons to reach to the solitary tract and nucleus, The solitary tract and nucleus is the second order neuron. From it, the axons reach to the ventral post-medial nucleus of the thalamus. The thalamic neurons send their axon from the third order neuron to reach to the gustatory cortex made by parietal operculum and insular cortex. So the gustatory pathway in general, it is three order neuron pathway. The first order neuron is the ganglia of the cranial nerve, whether that is the cranial nerve facial or glossopharyngeal or vagus. The ganglia itself, this is the first order neuron. It's the neuron cell body, first order neuron. From it, the axons reach to the second order neuron, which is the solitary nucleus and tract. The solitary nucleus and tracts, they send the axon of the neurons there to reach to the third order neuron, which is the thalamus. So the thalamus is always the third order neuron, the VPN, ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. The ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus neurons send their axons to terminate at the gustatory cortex, which is made by the parietal operculum and the insular cortex. This concludes everything related to the gustatory pathway. Please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me, and thank you very much. Goodbye.